The 9,826th meeting of the Security Council is called to order. The provisional agenda for this meeting is the situation in the Middle East. The agenda is adopted. The Security Council will now begin its consideration of item 2 of the agenda. Members of the Council have before them document S/2024/942, the text of a draft resolution submitted by the Russian Federation and the United States of America. I also wish to draw the attention of Council members to document S/2024/875, the report of the Secretary General on the United Nations Disengagement Observer Force. The Council is ready to proceed to the vote on the draft resolution before it. I shall put the draft resolution to the vote now. Will those in favor of the draft resolution contained in document S/2024/942 please raise their hand? The result of the voting is as follows. The draft resolution received 15 votes in favor. The draft resolution has been adopted unanimously as Resolution 2766 of 2024. I now give the floor to those members of the Council who wish to make statements after the vote. I now give the floor to the representative of Algeria.
Thank you, Mr. President. I would like to express my gratitude to the Russian Federation and to the United States for their efforts as penholders, co-penholders of the draft resolution we have just adopted. Your work has enabled us to unanimously renew the mandate of ENDOF, which comes at a critical juncture for Syria and for the whole region. In this regard, I wish to highlight the following points. First, the resolution underscores that, and I quote, there should be no military forces, military equipment, or personnel in the area of separation other than those of ENDOF. End of quote. Therefore, the actual presence of Israeli forces in the area is illegal and constitutes a flagrant violation of the 1974 disengagement agreement and relevant Security Council resolutions. Second, the resolution, and I quote, stresses that both parties must abide by the terms of the 1974 disengagement of forces agreement and scrupulously observe the ceasefire. The 1974 agreement stipulates that, and I quote, the parties will scrupulously observe the ceasefire on land, sea, and air, and will refrain from all military actions against each other from the time of the signing of this document in implementation of the United Nations Security Council Resolution 338, end of quote. Hence, the Israeli attacks on both civilian and military infrastructure in Syria, as well as its incursion into Syrian territory and occupation of new territory are clear violation of the agreement and clear violation of Security Council resolution. Just today, earlier today, a demonstration took place in Dar'a Governorate to protest the presence of the Israeli forces within Syrian territory and to demand its withdrawal. The protest was met with violence as Israeli soldiers opened fire, injuring a young man. To those who still doubt that we are witnessing the occupation of new territories in Syria, I would ask, what is your stance on this? These acts are neither defensive nor justified. They constitute an aggression against a UN member state and merit our firm condemnation. Third, the resolution we just adopted calls upon the parties concerned to implement immediately its Resolution 338. Let me recall that Resolution 338 calls for the immediate implementation of Security Council Resolution 242 in all its parts. Resolution 242 explicitly calls for the withdrawal of Israeli armed forces from territories occupied in 1967. Thus, the Israeli presence in the Golan Heights constitutes an occupation. Algeria reaffirms its steadfast position that the Golan Heights is an occupied Syrian territory. Furthermore, Algeria reiterates its full support of UNDOF and for its peacekeepers, whose safety and security must be ensured by all parties. And we extend our congratulations to Major General Anita Asmah on her appointment as head of mission and force commander of UNDOF, assuring her of our full support. In conclusion, Mr. President, I wish to emphasize that the fragile situation in Syria demands our collective solidarity and support. The international community must set aside its rivalries and competition to avert a catastrophic scenario in Syria and the broader region. We must work together constructively to assist the Syrian people in preserving their country's independence, unity, sovereignty, and territorial integrity, and in establishing new institutions for a brighter and democratic future for Syria. I thank you.
I thank the representative of Algeria for their statement. There are no more names inscribed on the list of speakers. The meeting is adjourned. The 9,827th meeting of the Security Council is called to order. The provisional agenda for this meeting is Threats to International Peace and Security. The agenda is adopted. In accordance with Rule 39 of the Council's Provisional Rules of Procedure, I invite Ms. Azumi Nakamitsu, High Representative for Disarmament Affairs, to participate in this meeting. It is so decided. In accordance with Rule 37 of the Council's Provisional Rules of Procedure, I invite the representative of Ukraine to participate in this meeting. It is so decided. The Security Council will now begin its consideration of item 2 of the agenda. I now give the floor to Ms. Azumi Nakamitsu.
Thank you very much, Mr. President. More than 1,000 days have passed since the Russian Federation's full-scale invasion of Ukraine launched on 24th of February 2022 in violation of the UN Charter and of international law. Since then, hostilities across Ukraine have continued to escalate, exacerbating humanitarian needs. Since the last briefing to the Security Council on this topic on 31st of October 2024, we have continued to witness unacceptable levels of civilian death and injuries, as well as the systematic and deliberate targeting by Russian Federation of Ukraine's energy infrastructure. These large-scale attacks raise grave concerns for the welfare of civilians who are facing a winter of hardship and misery. Meanwhile, incidents of conflict-related sexual violence and other violations of human rights also remained a grave concern. All parties to any armed conflict have an obligation to respect and protect civilians and civilian objects, as well as to comply with applicable international law, including international humanitarian law, which prohibits, amongst others, indiscriminate and disproportionate attacks, and to support international efforts to investigate violations. Mr. President, transfers of arms and ammunition and the provision of other forms of military assistance to the armed forces of Ukraine have also continued. The transfers have reportedly included heavy conventional weapons such as battle tanks, armored combat vehicles, combat aircraft, helicopters, large caliber artillery systems, missile systems, and uncrewed combat aerial vehicles, as well as remotely operated munitions and small arms and light weapons and their ammunition. There have also been reports of states transferring or planning to transfer weapons such as uncrewed aerial vehicles, ballistic missiles and ammunition to the Russian armed forces, and that those weapons have been used and are likely to be used in Ukraine. Reports also refer to an increase in military cooperation between the DPRK and the Russian Federation. This includes reports of the DPRK having transferred military supplies such as ballistic missiles and artillery shells, as well as technical exchanges and DPRK troop deployment to the Kursk region of the Russian Federation. Although the United Nations is not in a position to verify or confirm any claims or reports made, the Secretary General issued a statement on 3rd of November, noting his concern about reports of troops from the DPRK being sent to the Russian Federation, including their possible deployment to the conflict zone. He said this would represent a very dangerous escalation of war in Ukraine. I reiterate that any transfer of weapons and ammunition must take place consistently with the applicable international legal framework, including relevant Security Council resolutions which, in certain instances, impose sanctions and restrictive measures on such transfers. Mr. President, the use of armed uncrewed aerial vehicles and missiles by the Russian Federation continues to cause civilian death and injuries, as well as damage to civilian infrastructure in Ukraine. On 21st of November, the President of the Russian Federation confirmed that Russia had tested a new conventional medium-range missile called Oreshnik. This followed the use of US and UK-provided long-range weapons by the armed forces of Ukraine against the territory of the Russian Federation, some of which reportedly resulted in damage to civilian objects. I urge all concerned to refrain from any steps that may lead to further spillover and intensification of the conflict, as well as any further harm to civilians. Indeed, between 24th February 2022 and 30th of November 2024, the Office of the United Nations High Commissioner for Human Rights, OHCHR, recorded over 12,340 civilians killed and more than 27,836 civilians injured in Ukraine. The same office notes that 42% of casualties in Ukraine in November resulted from the use of long-range weapons launched by the Russian Federation, a significant increase from previous months. According to the UN Human Rights Monitoring Mission in Ukraine verified data, aerial bombs killed 341 civilians and injured 1,803 from 1 January through 30 November 2024, a threefold increase in fatalities and a sixfold increase in injuries from aerial bombs compared to 2023. In addition, there have also been reports of a number of cross-border strikes using missiles and uncrewed aerial vehicles by Ukraine inside the Russian Federation, with some reportedly resulting in damage to civilian objects. Just like any other weapons or weapon systems, armed uncrewed aerial vehicles and missiles must not be used in a manner inconsistent with international humanitarian law. The use of explosive weapons in populated areas remains one of the most significant threats to civilians in armed conflict. Such use of these weapons is unacceptable in view of the well-documented pattern of civilian harm and the likelihood of indiscriminate effects. Reports of the use and transfer of cluster munitions remain deeply concerning due to the indiscriminate harm these weapons can cause and the widespread contamination they leave behind. Equally alarming are recent announcements regarding the transfers of non-persistent anti-personnel landmines. These explosive devices are prohibited under the Convention on the Prohibition of the Use, Stockpiling, Production, and Transfer of Anti-Personnel Mines and on their destructions. The universal participation in and the full implementation at all times and under any circumstances of the Anti-Personnel Mine Ban Convention and the Convention on Cluster Munitions and Convention on Prohibitions or restrictions on the use of certain conventional weapons must remain a priority. I reiterate my call on all states to abide by their international humanitarian law obligations, and to become parties as a matter of priority to disarmament treaties and comply with the obligations therein. Compliance with these obligations is crucial in preventing unnecessary suffering or superfluous injury to persons and in protecting civilians. I also reiterate the Secretary-General's call for states to reduce the human cost of weapons, including by endorsing the political declaration on strengthening the protection of civilians from the humanitarian consequences arising from the use of explosive weapons in populated areas, if they have not already done so, and establish mechanisms to mitigate harm to civilians. Mr. President, measures to prevent and mitigate the risk of diversion of weapons and ammunition are key for preventing further instability and insecurity in Ukraine, the region, and beyond. Such efforts by all parties involved in arms transfers will also be essential to post-conflict recovery. Universal participation in arms control treaties and instruments, along with their full and effective implementation, is key to preventing the diversion of conventional arms and regulating the international arms trade. This includes Arms Trade Treaty, the Firearms Protocol, the Program of Action on Small Arms and Light Weapons and its international tracing instrument, and the Global Framework for Through-Life Conventional Ammunition Management. Mr. President, I reiterate Secretary-General's call for just, lasting, and comprehensive peace in Ukraine, consistent with the UN Charter and in line with the relevant General Assembly resolutions. The United Nations will continue to stand ready to use our good offices and to support all meaningful efforts to this end. I thank you very much for your attention.
I thank Ms. Nakamitsu for her briefing. I shall now make a statement in my capacity as representative of the United States. Thank you, Undersecretary General Nakamitsu, for your briefing. Colleagues, this is my last council session with you. Allow me to be direct. Nearly 3 years ago, when Russia invaded Ukraine, the Kremlin believed it could conquer another sovereign nation in violation of the UN Charter with little resistance. The Ukrainians, for their part, proved the Kremlin wrong and are courageously fighting for their homeland and future, for their Ukrainian identity, for their children, for their freedom, for their lives. The United States, as a permanent member of this Council, and along with partners from around the globe, will continue to help Ukraine defend itself from Russia's aggression. This is because we still believe in the UN Charter, which should remain the foundation of states' conduct. Ukraine must prevail against Russia's war of choice. There must be a just, sustainable peace rooted in the UN Charter. This document, the UN Charter, has meaning. It has helped keep the world safe from the scourge of another world war for 80 years. For 80 years, through thick and thin, this Council has worked together to uphold its principles and to oppose territorial conquest. But today, a permanent member of this Council is openly and unashamedly violating the UN Charter. Russia is violating resolutions of this Council, which it voted for, resolutions meant to keep a rogue nation from acquiring nuclear weapons. Nearly 3 years ago, we sat with the Russians in this chamber, urging de-escalation, negotiations, peace talks, anything but war. The Kremlin did not listen then, because Putin does not listen to the words spoken here. In that regard, I have to refer to another permanent member of this Council. China's support for Russia is in clear contradiction to the principles of the UN Charter. China has said in this Council that sovereignty and territorial integrity should be respected. But if China were serious about that, it would use its influence to stop Russia from violating Ukraine's sovereignty and territorial integrity. Let's look not at China's words, but its actions. China continues to supply Russia's war industrial base with dual-use items like bomb-making materials, machine parts, equipment and tools for weapons factories, technology powering drones and missiles. Russia needs these Chinese products for its attacks against Ukraine's civilians and infrastructure. Chinese companies provide them, profit from them. By continuing to permit these exports, Beijing's telegraphs tacit approval of Russia's war, and PRC companies have even helped develop and produce long-range attack UAVs for Russia. If China truly wants a peaceful resolution to Russia's war against Ukraine, it must end its supply to Russia's war machine, impose sanctions on Russia, call on Russia to withdraw its troops, and lead the international community as a permanent member of this council responsible for safeguarding the principles of the UN Charter. Instead, China is a decisive enabler of Russia's war against Ukraine and has refused to use its influence constructively. It has given Russia political cover by repeating Russia's false justifications for the war and by suggesting we should ignore the UN Charter because, quote, the situation on the ground has changed, unquote. China has suggested we not link Russia's aggression in Ukraine with the DPRK's pursuit of nuclear weapons, while it is clear Russia is helping the DPRK with its nuclear ambitions in return for troops and weapons to use against Ukraine. When it comes to Russia, China has demonstrated it is not a legitimate actor for peace. In this council, China outlined its three principles for the war: no expansion of the battlefield, no escalation of the conflict, and no provocations. But China stood aside as Russia violated all three principles by bringing the DPRK into the conflict. Russia has deployed nearly 12,000 DPRK troops, including elite special forces, to fight against Ukraine. Russia has also violated multiple resolutions of this council by importing from the DPRK more than 20,000 shipping containers of munitions, containing at least 6 million heavy artillery rounds and well over 100 ballistic missiles. China has considerable influence with both Moscow and Pyongyang, but it has declined to use that influence to oppose Russia-DPRK military cooperation. China has not criticized Russia for importing missiles and Shahed drones from Iran, or for testing on the people of Ukraine an experimental hypersonic missile capable of carrying a nuclear warhead. In this council, China has called for the protection of civilians and prisoners of war, but China has failed to condemn Russia's forces for committing summary executions, arbitrary detentions, torture, rape, and other forms of sexual violence, forced deportations of hundreds of children, deliberate attacks on Ukraine's energy grid and other critical infrastructure. China did not end its support to Russia when Russia weakened global food security by blockading grain exports through the Black Sea and by attacking grain ships, grain ports, and Ukraine's food production. Colleagues, Russia listens only to strength in action, something we collectively lacked when Russia invaded Crimea and when it invaded Georgia before that. Appeasement didn't work then, and it won't work now. That is why the United States and our partners will continue supporting Ukraine and the UN Charter's fundamental principles of sovereignty and territorial integrity. As an international community, we must reject wars of aggression. Look, I understand there were airstrikes both ways across the Russia-Ukraine border in the past 24 hours. Regrettably, there are reports that civilians were killed on both sides. We shouldn't be here. No civilian, Russian or Ukrainian, should be suffering. Russia started this war, and Russia can end this suffering. This is, as I said, my last council meeting with you. It has been an honor to serve in this council. The work we do matters. Our willingness to hold bad actors responsible matters. I wish that I could leave you on a more positive note. If Russia isn't held accountable, many more people will suffer in preventable wars. No leader should ever again believe they can conquer another country and not face a united global resistance. The world must always respond with strength to deter further aggression. I thank you for your camaraderie and leave you with my best wishes and with hope. I thank you. I resume my function as President of the Council. There it is. Right. Yeah, thank you. I now give the floor to the representative of the Russian Federation.
Mr. President, taking into account that this is your last meeting of the Council, please allow me to be very candid. We have always been, after all, but you have decided to only do so today, as you've just announced. If the United States had not supported the coup d'etat in Kiev in 2014, had not sponsored it, had not made Ukraine into an anti-Russia, had not allowed Ukraine, the Kiev regime, to undermine the Kiev agreements, which was something that was announced openly by the politicians who were supposed to be the guarantors of the agreement, then we wouldn't have had this at all. There would not have been the Crimea situation if the Kiev authorities, which came into power as a result of a coup in Kiev, had abided by the rights of all of its citizens instead of going against them with arms when they were conducting the so-called anti-terrorist operation using the army of Ukraine, which, by the way, is something that's prohibited in the Ukrainian constitution. Mr. President, even during the time that elapsed since our last meeting on Ukraine on the 16th of December, the trends that we pointed out then have become even more clear. And they can be summed up in the following manner. On the one hand, we have the United States administration, which lost the elections, but it's trying desperately to use up the remainder of monies to support Ukraine. At the same time, what is being done by the American politicians, the lame ducks, is in contradiction with the line that is proclaimed by the elect American president, who will enter into office on the 20th of January. On the other hand, the expired Ukrainian president, losing on the battleground, is doing everything he can to undermine any peaceful initiatives and to provoke Russia into escalating the conflict. Over the recent days, the former Ukrainian comedian has managed to make at least 3 steps taking us away from a peaceful resolution of the conflict. On the 18th of December in Moscow, there was an explosion as a result of which the head of the Radiation, Chemical and Biological Defense Forces was killed. Mr. Kirillov was killed and his assistants, and this was done at the behest of the Kiev regime. The next day, the perpetrator of this act of terror was apprehended, and he confirmed that he had been recruited by the Ukrainian Special Services. This crime supports fully the inhumane and terrorist nature of the current Ukrainian leadership. These crimes and others aimed against the Russian elite, military, creative, and political. What's behind them are the Western mentors of Kiev, and they are trying to not pay attention to what is going on and thus betraying those principles that they constantly proclaim internationally. In this regard, I would like to mention that General Kirillov has on many occasions provided facts confirming the military biological activity of Washington in Ukraine, and we have every reason to believe that in these closed biological laboratories by the United States, which are located all over the world, what was being done was biological weapons were being developed, and we would like to assure that the American puppeteers in Kiev that our investigations of these things will not end with the death of Mr. Kirillov. We need to shed light on all of of the anti-humane experiences on the Ukrainians. The next step to escalate was undertaken yesterday when yet another shelling was approved inside the Russian territory using long-range weaponry. On the 18th of December, ATACMS and Storm Shadows were used so as to strike a facility in Rostov Oblast. All of the missiles were destroyed by our air defense. One managed to impact damage on a technical building. The Kiev regime knew then that there would be immediate reaction to this strike. And it did happen. In the early hours of today, there was a group strike using precision long-range strike on a Ukrainian Air Force command post, the design bureau Luch, which deals with missile developments, and also the Patriot complex, which was nearby. The goals of that strikes were attained. All of the objects were hit, and according to our information, some high-ranking Ukrainian armed forces people were hit. And the third step now towards escalation, the mass missile strike against the city of Rilsk in the Kursk Oblast. This took place in the day today from the multiple rocket launch system HIMARS. The goal of the attack were the culture center, a stadium, a teacher's college, a school, and a fireman's unit. According to current information, 6 people died, including 1 child. 10 people are in a hospital. As you can understand, our reaction to this crime against peaceful citizens will not be long in coming. And acting this way, Zelensky ignores the interests and opinion of his own citizens, who a considerable number of them are speaking against new escalation steps as they lead to the destruction of companies and energy objects which are important for the Ukrainian economy. As a result of that, the capacity of Ukraine to live through this winter is something that many experts are questioning. But the former comedian, in order to keep himself in power, is prepared to endanger the entire country he is holding hostage and sacrifice all of its citizens. His henchmen are daily capturing people on the streets and sending them to the front. And this, of course, impacts the quality and the morale of the Ukrainian army. As a result, according to the Ukrainian military leaders themselves, the number of deserters at the end of November was 200,000 people. Just in November, 85,000 Ukrainian military left their positions. This is 3 times the number in October. Also, those Ukrainians which are being trained abroad are deserting. In Poland alone, on average, 12 people leave their training. In France, they are saying that the Anakivska brigade disappeared and the remain of the brigade had to be disbanded. And this is the elite of the Ukrainian army. The losses of the Ukrainian army in 2024 exceeded 560,000, and since 2022, that number is over 1 million. So the Western masters of Ukraine are trying not to notice that. For example, the outgoing Secretary of State, Anthony Blinken, yesterday recently demanded that Kiev start mobilizing people as of 18 years of age. Currently, the age of recruitment is 26. Boris Johnson, the same person who prevented Russia and Ukraine of signing peace in the March of 2022, acknowledged in one of his interviews that the West is fighting Russia in Ukraine by proxy. Well, you remember what Lindsey Graham said something about that. In September 2023, he said assisting Ukraine by the United States, he called that a good investment for the American people. We're destroying the Russian army, he said, without losing a single soldier, he said triumphantly in Kiev. And very recently, Colonel Todd Schmidt, in his report, stated that the war in Ukraine became an open-air laboratory for the American military. Mr. President, calling the military campaign in Ukraine a good investment, Mr. Graham, when he was saying that, was not just using this as a figure of speech. Ukraine have become a gold mine for the military-industrial complex for Anglo-Saxon countries and its allies, most of all for the American companies. According to data in 2023, half of all of the weapons sales was by the American countries. They received $317 billion, 50% of global revenue from that. Overall, the revenue of 100 major weapons manufacturers in 2023, according to the data from the Stockholm Institute on Peace Research, reached $632 billion. It would be naive to think that these unprincipled traders would give up on their huge profits for the benefit of the hapless Ukrainians. At the same time, the military companies work in direct link with the Kiev regimes. 25 foreign lobby and consulting companies have started representing the interests of Ukraine free of charge. One of such companies is BGR Government Affairs, and their leadership publicly called for increasing military assistance to Kiev. By the way, one of their clients is a major supplier and exporter of weapons, the American Raytheon company. There's another method which is being used by the American military-industrial complex. It's the financing of analytical centers, and then conclusions on their use by the mass media. So money is being made not just by manufacturing their weapons to the Ukrainians, but they're also using the American citizens when they artificially pad the prices of their goods. Despite the fact that this undermines the well-being of Americans, the outgoing American administration is applying up with the manufacturing companies on this, especially since, as was said by Mr. Blinken, most of the $100 billion spent by Washington to Ukraine is spent within the American military-industrial complex. And this is the way this problem was commented by the independent Senator Bernie Sanders. He said that the military subcontractors padded their prices by 40% and sometimes as incredible as 4,000%. In October, the RTX Corporation and Raytheon that I just earlier mentioned is part of that, was fined $950 million for artificially hiking the prices for the Ministry of Defense. They also misled about their costs and bribes to make sure that they receive their contacts. Then Bernie Sanders continued and said that when you start talking about improving the lives of American workers, what he hears as a response is, no, we can't afford that. But when you start talking about the military-industrial complex, what he hears, yes, almost without any debate. We have already stated at the last meeting why this criminal campaign, including the man in the green sweatshirt, is so afraid of the audit of the amount given to Ukraine by the Trump team. And the European Union also should be talking about a possible audit. Ursula von der Leyen have already gave them 130 billion euros. 47.3 is military assistance. The words by Bernie Sanders only illustrate the level of corruption which accompanies Western supplies of weapons to the Kiev regime. We're discovering new details of this criminal business. Recently, for example, it was announced that the audit of the Department of Defense, the United States, showed that there was an incorrect inventory of the Javelin missiles to Kiev, and the Pentagon has to admit that the whereabouts of more than half of Javelin and Stingers sent to Ukraine are unknown. We can help our American colleagues here. If you want to know where they are, please take a look at the dark internet trading platforms, and you can see that terrorists of all kinds are buying them up, possibly so as to use them in the regional conflict somewhere in Africa or even in an American or European airport. You will have been warned by us about this. Distinguished colleagues, it's difficult to say what this will end up doing for Ukraine and its leader, who is trying to pull the wool over everyone's eyes by saying that he's ready for peace. In actual fact, he's doing everything to escalate the conflict. As we have stated many times, peace for him is the worst possible scenario because for him, with only 11% support on the part of the citizens of Ukraine, what we'll have to do then is organize elections and lose power, and then be held accountable for all of the crimes he committed against his own people when he became a pawn in the geopolitical game played by the West against Russia. Therefore, he is afraid of negotiations of any kind, and he rejects one peace initiative after another. For example, the recent one from President Orban about Christmas truce and POW exchange. The real attitude of the Kiev clique to any negotiations was expressed by the head of President's office, the Great Cardinal Andrei Yermak. He said that the real negotiations on peace will only start when Russia will have depleted all of its resources for military activities. As you all understand, what this means is never. And this true face of the gang in power in Ukraine is something that we are familiar with that. We have no illusions, all the more so since, as we have stated, we do not need a frozen conflict. What we need is to make sure that there is a resolution, a just resolution, and a long-term one, and elimination all of the root causes for it, which everyone well knows. So my advice to all of those who is hoping that the military activities will stop, please do not have any illusions about the real intent of the comedian Zelensky. We never had them to begin with, and we therefore continue a special military operation whose goals will be implemented. And then, in conclusion, one more point. At the beginning of this month, a delegation of the United States insisted on having a meeting on Ukrainian children whose rights Russia is supposedly violating. We drew the attention of our colleagues then in contradistinction to the fabricated topic of the Ukrainian children, which is used by the Kiev regime so as to smear Russia. There are other children-related topics which demand the attention of the Security Council, in particular, the situation of children in Gaza, in the occupied Palestinian territory as a whole. We called at the time the United States to have a meeting on that before the presidency ends. Of course, our American colleagues did not heed this appeal of ours. The fate of the children in Gaza is not of interest to them, and this topic is inconvenient for their strategic ally, Israel. We think such double standards are unacceptable for this in the Security Council. We therefore are going to request a meeting on children in Palestine in January, and would ask the upcoming Algerian presidency to keep that in mind for their plan of work. Thank you.
I thank the representative of the Russian Federation for their statement. I now give the floor to the representative of the United Kingdom.
Thank you, Mr. President, and thank you to the High Representative for Disarmament Affairs for her briefing. This is the 17th time in the last year that Russia has called a meeting that seeks to rewrite history and undermine UN-verified facts. Their aim is to distort reality so thoroughly that the international community can no longer discern what is true. We continuously listen to Russia's attempt to justify its violation of the Charter, its invasion of a neighbour. But the Charter provides no justification for Russia's actions whatsoever. And now we sit here for the 17th time this year, listening to Russia try to tell us that Ukraine should not be permitted to defend itself against Russian aggression. That no matter how many weapons and troops Russia deploys or gets from third parties to prolong their aggression, Ukraine should be prevented from seeking support from its partners in defense of its sovereignty and territorial integrity. If Russia is so concerned about Ukraine's defensive action, then maybe Russia should stop invading. The solution is really very simple. Russia should withdraw its troops from its neighbour and cease its aggression. Russian weapons have now been used in Ukraine for over 1,000 days. They are targeting Ukrainian cities and energy infrastructure, leaving millions without essential services, not to mention the deadly, well-documented attacks on medical facilities. The WHO has recorded over 2,000 attacks on healthcare in Ukraine, including hospitals, since the start of Russia's invasion. and 12,000 Ukrainian civilians have been killed. 12,000 innocent lives, leaving behind grief and trauma for their families. But it is not Russia's weapons alone that are costing countless lives. DPRK and Iran have supplied Russia with munitions and ballistic missiles for use on the battlefield in Ukraine. And now thousands of DPRK troops have joined forces with Russia, prolonging the war and increasing the suffering of the Ukrainian people. And we know that DPRK will be extracting a high price in return, which has significant implications for global security, significant implications for all of us. Madam President, this Christmas I suggest the Russian delegation reads How Much Land Does a Man Need by Leo Tolstoy. It's a story about a man who, in his greed to acquire more and more land, exhausts himself and dies. He's buried in a 6-foot grave, which is all the land he ends up with. The moral is quite clear. The Russians would do well to heed the wisdom of their forebears, because the supporters of Ukraine are on the right side of history. Until Russia ceases its aggression, we will continue to support Ukraine in defending itself. And we will continue to support their efforts to find a just and lasting peace based on the principles of the UN Charter. It was a breach of the Charter that brought us to this horrific situation, and only full adherence to the Charter will resolve it. And that means Russia ceasing its aggression and fully withdrawing from a sovereign and secure Ukraine. Thank you.
I thank the representative of the United Kingdom, and I now give the floor to the Republic of Korea's representative.
Thank you, Madam President. I extend my gratitude to High Representative Nakamitsu for the timely briefing. Today's meeting is the third that the Security Council has held this month on the situation in Ukraine. The topics addressed at the two last meetings, the war's impact on children and the attacks on critical infrastructure, still require urgent attention and action from the international community. In addition, just 2 days ago, we gathered once again in this august chamber to address another critical issue, non-proliferation, DPRK. And a majority of the Security Council members condemn the illegal military cooperation between Russia and North Korea then. On all previous occasions, we clearly heard the international community's collective voice urging Russia to end its unprovoked war against Ukraine. Colleagues, the Republic of Korea reiterates its consistent positions that Ukraine is acting to defend its people and its territories in line with the UN Charter and international law with the international community's assistance. Indeed, it is quite clear that this conflict began with Russia's invasion of a neighboring country in violation of the UN Charter. Needless to say, the global support for Ukraine's effort to safeguard its people and territory is entirely legitimate. For this region, as we have previously mentioned, we are of the view that today's meeting again on the issue of weapons transferred to Ukraine is irrelevant. Russia is arguing that Western countries' provision of weapons is prolonging the war. However, few countries would support this argument. The world knows the difference between an aggressor and a victim, as witnessed by the overwhelming majority of UN member states repeatedly condemning Russia in the General Assembly. Despite its best efforts, Russia cannot justify its unjust war against Ukraine, nor will it succeed in shifting blame regarding the origins of this illegal war and its subsequent escalation. To make the matter worse, military cooperation between Russia and North Korea is significantly intensifying. North Korea supplied Russia with large amounts of munitions, missiles, and artillery, violating the Security Council resolution. In addition, over 11,000 North Korean troops were sent to fight in Russia's war against Ukraine, with more than 1,000 casualties. This unexpected level of collusion raises serious concerns about the future of this illegal coalition. Their cooperation is undermining the global non-proliferation regime and making the conflict internationalized. The international community must unequivocally and resolutely condemn this illegal military cooperation and call for its immediate cessation. Madam President, as people in other parts of the world look forward to gathering with their beloved families and friends for the holidays, Ukrainians are enduring harsh winter conditions, a situation exacerbated by Russia's illegal and inhumane attacks against Ukraine's energy network affecting over 1 million civilians. We once again urge Russia, as a responsible permanent member of the Security Council, to change course and end this brutal war. The first crucial step would be the return of North Korean troops, as well as their own back home where they belong. We hope that 2025 will be the year Ukrainians can finally return to the peaceful lives they knew before the war. The Republic of Korea will continue to stand with Ukraine and its people in their efforts to achieve a just, lasting peace and make this hope a reality. I thank you.
I thank the representative of the Republic of Korea for their statement, and I now give the floor to the representative of France.
Madam President, I would like to begin by thanking the High Representative, Madam Izumi Nakamitsu, for her briefing. This umpteenth meeting on transfers of arms requested by Russia is only a smokescreen to mask the way in which it continues to treat the sovereignty and independence of Ukraine. There is one aggressor, Russia, which has attacked a sovereign country that was not threatening it at all. And there is a party under attack, Ukraine, which is free, like any country, to choose its future. Russia cannot shift to others the responsibility for a conflict that it chose to unleash and that it has continued for almost 3 years without any respect for international law. Let us remember that Russia ignored the order of the International Court of Justice, which ordered it on the 16th of March 2022 to immediately suspend its military operations. It has ignored resolutions of the General Assembly of the United Nations, which condemned this aggression 7 times with a broad majority, a very broad majority, and called for the respect for the territorial integrity of Ukraine. Let us say this once again: Russia can choose at any time to cease its aggression without harming its own security. Article 51 of the Charter is very clear. Ukraine has the right to defend itself. The exercise of this right of legitimate defense includes the possibility to take out Russian military targets involved in operations targeting Ukrainian territory. Madam President, for more than 1,000 days, Russia has violated international humanitarian law by carrying out systematic strike campaigns on civilian populations and Ukrainian civilian infrastructure, particularly in the energy sector. Whilst Ukraine is preparing to enter its 3rd winter of war, France will remain committed to respond to the humanitarian needs of the Ukrainian population. The pursuit by Russia of this illegal aggression, which is facilitated by transfers of arms and is supporting this war effort. Russia continues to undermine the international architecture for non-proliferation by procuring ballistic missiles and drones from Iran in violation of Security Council resolutions which it supported, also receiving munitions and ballistic missiles from North Korea. The deployment in Russia of North Korean soldiers and their fighting alongside Russian forces is another escalation. This commitment, which was probably not expected for Pyongyang, is unacceptable and must be condemned by the international community. France calls upon all states to abstain from providing Russia with military equipment and dual-use goods and any components which feed into this war of aggression. Madam President, France, with our partners, will continue to stand alongside Ukraine and support it in all respects as long as necessary. We will continue to provide Ukraine with indispensable military support for defending its independence, sovereignty, and territorial integrity in accordance with the Charter. The so-called capitulation of the party under attack cannot be the condition for negotiations. It will never be the foundation for a just and lasting peace. This can only ever be based on respect for the fundamental principles of the Charter, and therefore the sovereignty, territorial integrity, and independence of Ukraine. Thank you.
I thank the representative of France for their statement. I now give the floor to the representative of Slovenia.
Thank you, Madam President. I wish to thank USG Nakamitsu for her briefing. Let me make a couple of points on behalf of my delegation. Firstly, every country has an inalienable right to defend itself in accordance with Article 51 of the UN Charter. By extension, every country has the right to procure the means to defend themselves. As underlined by USG Nakamitsu, the acquisition itself must be in line with the international legal framework, which among others includes resolutions adopted by this Council. It is worth pointing out to the source of inconsistencies with international law during this war. It is Russia that illegally invaded Ukraine. At the same time, for over a year now, reports about artillery shell and ballistic missile transfers from the DPRK have been mounting. And these weapons have been sustaining the ongoing aggression. This represents a violation of Security Council resolutions and needs to be further addressed. The Wednesday's briefing was informative in this regard. Secondly, we are gravely concerned with the extent of mine use in Ukraine. Russia has already laid an estimated 2 million mines, making Ukraine the most mine-contaminated country in the world. To date, more than 1,200 civilian victims of mines and explosive remnants of war were documented. This is just the start, as these weapons will pose a threat to the civilian population for years to come. In this regard, we call for the full respect of the Anti-Personnel Mine Ban Convention. Madam President, Slovenia is greatly concerned with the escalation of this war. It is engulfing more and more territories. We're witnessing ever larger aerial attacks and use of modernized weapons with more firepower. Each day of the war increases the risk of spillover and of crossing the point of no return. We need peace in Ukraine as soon as possible. It cannot come a moment too soon. But for it to last, it needs to be in line with the UN Charter and international law. I thank you.
I thank the representative of Slovenia for their remarks, and I now give the floor to the representative of Guyana.
Thank you, Madam President. I thank High Representative Nakamitsu for the important updates provided. Today's meeting comes on the heels of alarming reports of further escalations in the war between Russia and Ukraine. Media reports this morning of a missile strike that damaged 6 foreign diplomatic missions in Kyiv and killed at least 1 individual are deeply distressing. Guyana maintains that any attack directed against a diplomatic facility is unacceptable. We reaffirm the provisions of the Vienna Convention on Diplomatic Relations of 1961, including the inviolability of diplomatic premises and call for a full and impartial investigation into this incident. Madam President, UN agencies grappling with the humanitarian fallout of this war have all sounded the alarm about the gravity and scale of the violations of international humanitarian law and international human rights law being committed in Ukraine. In addition to reports of human rights abuses, one persistent pattern observed is the almost willful disregard for the principles of distinction, proportionality, and distinction with the use of weapons that are indiscriminate by nature and where the effects of their use cannot be limited as required under international humanitarian law. In their latest update, the Human Rights Monitoring Mission to Ukraine has noted an increase in civilian casualties from the use of aerial glide bombs in densely populated urban centers, including Kharkiv, Sumy, and Zaporizhia. The Office of the High Representative for Disarmament Affairs has also repeatedly expressed concern about reports of the use of cluster munitions and widespread contamination with mines and explosive remnants of war in Ukraine, underscoring that these weapons can contaminate communities for decades to come. According to the United Nations Development Programme, Ukraine is now considered the most mined country in the world, with potentially 23% of its land at risk of contamination with landmines and unexploded ordnance. It is estimated that clearing landmines and unexploded ordnance in Ukraine is likely to cost over $34 billion. Several reports indicate that most civilian casualties recorded to date were caused by use of explosive weapons with wide area effects in populated areas, such as artillery shells and rockets, bombs, missiles, loitering munitions, and other explosive munitions dropped by unmanned aerial vehicles. As a state party to the Convention on Cluster Munitions and Anti-Personnel Mine Ban Convention, Guyana is gravely concerned about the devastating and lasting impact of the use of landmines and cluster munitions. They have no place in this world. We also emphasize the fact that conventional arms and ammunitions are at risk of diversion throughout their life cycle, and even more so when they are transferred into an armed conflict. We call upon all states transferring weapons and ammunition into the conflict area to comply fully with their obligations under international law and with the international disarmament instruments to which they are party. Weapons transfers must be conducted within the existing international legal framework, including UN Security Council resolutions, and with adequate controls in place to prevent their irregular transfer. We also continue to stress that any lasting solution to this conflict will not be achieved through military action, but rather through diplomacy and good faith negotiations conducted in accordance with the provisions of the UN Charter and international law. In conclusion, Madam President, we reiterate our call for the Russian Federation to withdraw its military forces from the internationally recognized territory of Ukraine and urge the parties to commit to a political and diplomatic process towards ending the conflict. I thank you.
I thank the representative of Guyana for their statement, and I now give the floor to the representative of Japan.
Thank you, Madam President. I also thank High Representative Izumi Nakamitsu for her briefing. On Monday, Council members once again condemned the humanitarian consequences caused by Russia's aggression, a blatant violation of the UN Charter. Today's meeting was called by Russia with a shamefully familiar topic to discuss the so-called increasing weapon supplies by the West to the Kyiv regime. As always, this is totally misguided. Make no mistake, there's only one aggressor in this conflict. It was Russia and no other that launched this unprovoked war of aggression. It is Russia that has systematically violated international law, including the UN Charter, and escalated the situation. The country under attack
is Ukraine, which is defending its independence, sovereignty, and territorial integrity. To end this war, it is Russia that must stop its aggression in the first place. Madam President, just this past Wednesday, the Council condemned unlawful military cooperation between Russia and North Korea, including the transfer of ballistic missiles from North Korea to Russia in violation of UN Security Council resolutions, and the engagement in combat against Ukraine of North Korean troops deployed to Russia, which constitutes a clear violation of international law, including the UN Charter. We also reiterate our deep concern about military cooperation between Iran and Russia. We must focus on Russia's violation of international law and not fall prey to its disinformation or malicious tactics. We continue to strongly and unequivocally condemn actions that violate the UN Charter. At the same time, we remain committed to supporting Ukraine's legitimate efforts to defend itself. We have not and will not waver in stating that any attempts to undermine Ukraine's sovereignty and territorial integrity are unacceptable. We reiterate in the strongest terms our demand that Russia immediately and unconditionally withdraw from Ukraine. Madam President, as this is the last scheduled meeting of this month, I wish to convey our profound appreciation to the United States as the presidency for its leadership and dedication in steering the Council's work in December. In addition, as our two-year term on the Security Council draws to a close, we extend our deepest gratitude to all of the Council members, the Security Council Affairs Division colleagues, as well as the interpreters for your cooperation. It has been a distinct honor to work in pursuit of maintaining international peace and security. As we step away, we reaffirm our unwavering support for the vital work of this Council. We look forward to serving once again this august body as a responsible member within a decade. I thank you.
I thank the representative of Japan for their remarks. And I now give the floor to the representative of China.
President, I thank High Representative Nakamitsu for her briefing. At present, the crisis in Ukraine continues to drag on, and the fighting has shown no signs of abatement. The continued influx of large quantities of weapons and ammunition into the battlefield with expanding varieties, increasing lethality and destruction, and the greater risks of diversion and proliferation is a cause for deep concern. I wish to reiterate that weapons may help win the war, but cannot bring about lasting peace. It is imperative to observe the three principles of no expansion of the battlefield, no escalation of fighting, and no provocation by any party, and to promote a de-escalation as soon as possible. We once again call on the parties to the conflict to move towards the same direction and start peace talks at an early date. We call on the international community to actively create conditions and provide assistance to this end. President, since the outbreak of the war, China has been calling on the parties to the conflict to realize a ceasefire, start negotiations, and restore peace as soon as possible. This is what we have been saying and what we have been doing in the past 3 years or so. China has always been committed to promoting a political settlement and has been working for peace and promoting dialogue. The day before yesterday, the Group of Friends for Peace on the Ukraine Crisis held another meeting, during which representatives of 17 countries of the Global South, including China, Brazil, Algeria, South Africa, and Turkey, jointly assessed the current situation, expressed concern over the recent escalation of the conflict, reaffirmed the importance of respect for the principles of sovereignty and territorial integrity, and the legitimate concerns of all states, and reiterated their strong call for the cessation of hostilities as soon as possible, and for the realization of a comprehensive and lasting political settlement of the Ukraine crisis on the basis of the UN Charter and international law. At the same time, they also reaffirmed the readiness of the countries of the Global South to continue to play a constructive role to that end. President, China's efforts for peace are well known to the international community and have received recognition and support of the vast majority of countries. Russia, Ukraine, countries of the Global South, and many European countries have all welcomed China's role and contribution to the resolution of the Ukraine crisis. The United States is the only country that has chosen to turn a blind eye to China's efforts and has continued to support the crisis. The United States is the only country that has chosen to turn a blind eye to China's efforts and has continued to spread false information in public. Just now, your colleague, Ambassador Wood, in his statement as the U.S. representative, said that this may be the last time for him to participate in council meeting. I see that he is no longer here. Yet, he didn't give up the last chance to blatantly attack and smear China, making it sound as if it were China's fault that the war has continued to this day. I have responded to the relevant erroneous remarks of the U.S. side many times before, so I will not repeat them today. Given that this may be the last time this year for the Council to consider the Ukraine issue and may well be the last open meeting of the Security Council, looking ahead to the new year, I wish to express 3 points of hope to the U.S. side. First, China didn't create the Ukraine crisis, nor is it a party to the crisis. The United States cannot, on the one hand, hope that China will play a greater role in ending the war, while, on the other hand, keeps discrediting China's efforts for peace and continues to slander and put pressure on China. We hope that the U.S. will stop its senseless blame game and its provocation of antagonism and confrontation. Instead, it should work with the countries concerned, including China, to build unity and consensus and create conditions and an atmosphere conducive to a political settlement of the Ukraine crisis. Second, no country in the world can enjoy absolute security. One country's security cannot be at the expense of other countries' security. The United States, under the pretext of maintaining regional security, attempts to use this opportunity to weaken and contain other countries to serve its own agenda. This will only create more disputes and chaos in the world. We hope that the United States will abandon the zero-sum mentality of the Cold War, stop taking advantage of the Ukraine crisis to advance its geopolitical strategy, and make real efforts for the early restoration of peace and stability on the European continent. Third, the current situation regarding the Ukraine issue is changing. Both parties to the conflict have released political signals to the outside world, clearly expressing their willingness to engage in negotiations. The international community's discussions are increasingly geared towards negotiations and edging closer to peace. This fully demonstrates that the momentum for a ceasefire, an end to the war, and the restoration of peace is building up. We hope that the United States will face up to the changes in the situation, stop clamoring for war, stop obstructing the efforts of the international community for peace, and come to the right track of promoting a political settlement to the crisis at an early date. Thank you.
I thank the representative of China for their remarks, and I now give the floor to the representative of Algeria.
Thank you, Madam President. Please allow me to thank Under-Secretary General Mrs. Nakamitsu for her valuable briefing. President, the ongoing war in Ukraine that has engulfed the Russian territories rages on. Its effects continue to weigh on the peoples of the region at large. The losses of innocent human lives, including among children and women, have been on the rise since the outbreak of the conflict. The suffering of civilians, including the injured and the displaced, mounts. Many now dream of a warm shelter where they can seek refuge from the harsh winter conditions. Still, this conflict's economic repercussions continue to reverberate not only in the region but across the world, mainly in developing countries whose peoples have been largely affected by the energy and food crises. Unfortunately, the logic of confrontation and escalation, regional and international wrangling, and polarization continue to prevail, affecting the course of this conflict that will enter its third year. Algeria has repeatedly warned that such a logic will fuel tension, thus plunging the region into a quagmire of endless conflicts and crises. This is the sad reality on the ground. Tension has been fueled by the flow of weapons and ammunition to conflict zones, thus fomenting the war and its risks and steering us away from a peaceful political process that can lead to a peaceful settlement of the conflict. I would like to reaffirm the following points. Firstly, the ongoing escalation and bloody armed confrontation remain a grave cause of concern for Algeria. We condemn again the violations of international law, including international humanitarian law. We call again on both parties to exercise restraint, de-escalate, respect their international obligations, and protect civilians as a top priority. Targeting civilians and civilian infrastructure is unacceptable under any circumstances. This is prohibited under international humanitarian law. Secondly, we express our deep concern about the use of lethal and destructive ammunition and weapons in conflict zones, which was recently reinforced by the use of modern, medium, and long-range missiles in the Ukrainian and Russian territories. We call on both parties to ensure that these weapons do not fall into the hands of criminal, terrorist, and extremist groups that often use such weapons in hostile acts against defenseless civilians to exercise hegemony. Thirdly, we call again on both parties to prioritize dialogue and diplomacy and to engage in inclusive and constructive negotiations away from politicization. The war and clashes have had limited impact on advancing progress towards peace. The time has thus come to give diplomacy a genuine chance to achieve a just and lasting peace. This peace must be rooted in the principles and purposes of the Charter of the UN, which we all uphold, and must take into consideration the legitimate security considerations or concerns of both parties. The international community must step up its diplomatic efforts at all levels to create conditions conducive for negotiations, to defuse the war, and achieve peace and security in the region. Thank you.
I thank the representative of Algeria for their statement, and I now give the floor to the representative of Mozambique.
Thank you, Madam President. I thank the United States for convening this meeting. I also thank Ms. Izumi Nakamitsu, High Representative for Disarmament Affairs, for her valuable insights. I also welcome the permanent representative of Ukraine in this meeting. Madam President, the evolving situation in Ukraine continues to command our grave concern, particularly in light of the recent escalations and the deepening humanitarian crisis. The Security Council's decision to meet for the second time this week underscores the urgency and gravity of the situation. These frequent deliberations, among countless others since the conflict's inception, consistently reveal one common thread: an unwavering collective aspiration for peace despite varying perspectives on its achievement. However, we observe with deep concern that developments on the ground reflect an increasing reliance on military solutions rather than peaceful conflict resolution mechanisms. This trajectory inevitably compounds the challenges of establishing lasting peace and stability. The unprecedented scale of weapons transfers serves as a stark indicator of deteriorating trust in an already fragile and complex regional international landscape. Madam President, while we fully recognize every state's sovereign right to self-defense as enshrined in the United Nations Charter, including through arms procurement, we must exercise prudence in this regard. The massive influx of arms, ammunition, and military equipment carries the potential to intensify and prolong this conflict, potentially undermining broader international efforts toward peace and security maintenance. Of particular concern are the risks of weapons diversion to unauthorized actors and, most critically, the disproportionate impact on civilian populations who continue to bear the heaviest burden of this conflict. Madam President, to mitigate the devastating consequences of the extensive arms flows, we propose two mitigation measures. First, all parties must uphold responsible and transparent arms transfer, consistent with the existing international legal framework. This is crucial to prevent the unregulated transfers of arms, which can lead to weapons proliferation and illicit trafficking. Second, both exporting and recipient states must fulfill their respective obligations. Exporting states must refrain from transferring arms where risks exist of human rights violations or breaches of international humanitarian law. Recipient states must ensure that the arms transferred are used in a manner consistent with applicable international legal instruments and are not diverted or transferred to other destinations. Comprehensive risk assessment mechanisms are fundamental to this process. Madam President, while mitigation measures are crucial, they serve only as temporary solutions. True conflict resolution demands genuine political will to address both its immediate and underlying causes essential for achieving lasting peace and stability. In this context, Mozambique reiterates its steadfast position and urges the relevant parties to immediately halt hostilities, engage in direct, meaningful negotiations in good faith, and adopt a constructive, inclusive approach focused on mutual benefits rather than competitive advantage. And finally, Madam President, as this is the last statement we make before exiting the Council, I would like to thank members of this body for the support given to us during our 2-year term of the Security Council. We also thank the Secretariat, interpreters, and those behind the scenes who have helped us during our membership. I thank you.
I thank the representative of Mozambique for their statement, and I now give the floor to the representative of Ecuador.
Thank you very much, Madam President, and I'd like to thank the High Representative, Madam Nakamitsu, for her briefing. Ecuador laments the fact that almost 3 years since the beginning of the invasion of Ukraine, and after more than 100 meetings of this Council, we still don't see any possible signs of a peaceful outcome to this conflict. On the contrary, hostilities and the risks of escalation continue to intensify, exacerbating the already tense geopolitical situation and increasing the danger of a broader confrontation. A few days ago, this Council received a report from OCHA on the humanitarian situation in Ukraine. The reports are alarming, particularly given the arrival of winter and the systematic destruction of the energy infrastructure of the country. The report recalled also that over the last 3 years, where civilians have suffered, they continue to suffer the greatest consequences from a war that was not of their choosing. And this morning we heard about new missile attacks on Ukraine's capital that led to civilian injuries and damage to civilian infrastructure and embassies of various countries. Ecuador condemns robustly these attacks. They violate international humanitarian law, they increase the suffering of civilians, and they worsen the tensions in a conflict which urgently requires de-escalation. Once again, I call upon the parties to abstain from using explosive weapons in populated areas and take the fighting away from urban areas and nuclear installations. International humanitarian law is clear when it comes to the prohibition of attacks against civilians and civilian infrastructure, and this law must be respected. President, with regard to the issue that we are looking at today, Ecuador's position is clear. The transfer of arms and munitions must be in strict adherence to the internationally applicable legal framework and pertinent resolutions of the Security Council. Ecuador supports the recommendations put forward by High Representative Nakamitsu with regard to the measures necessary to mitigate the risks of diversion and proliferation of arms and munitions. States must act responsibly at every stage of the transfer chain in order to prevent diversion, illicit trafficking and misuse of arms. This is something that history has proven, even years after a ceasefire, that weapons used in conflicts can continue to affect civilians and become a factor of instability in the long term. The reports with regard to the use and transfer of cluster munitions and anti-personnel mines are particularly worrying, bearing in mind the indiscriminate effects that these weapons have. The full implementation of the Ottawa Convention on Anti-Personnel Mines, the Convention on Cluster Munitions, and the Convention on Prohibitions or Restrictions on the Use of Certain Conventional Weapons must continue to be a priority. And we reiterate the need to give priority to the protection of civilians and the goal of bringing about global stability over and above any arguments with regard to industry, production, or distribution. Excellencies, colleagues, we cannot underestimate the risks posed by a greater escalation of the conflict and its implications for international security. The use of ever more destructive weapons, as well as the mobilization of thousands of soldiers from the Democratic People's Republic of Korea towards the front lines, and their potential participation in the hostilities are something that the international community should study in particular, and it should be followed up by this Council. The parties should act responsibly and with restraint and abstain from adopting any measure that could lead to a prolongation and intensification of the war. The strategy of escalating in order to de-escalate is extremely dangerous and moves us away from a peaceful solution. Madam President, reversing the current and dangerous direction of travel and bringing about a ceasefire requires diplomatic efforts and political will. Diplomacy and dialogue cannot be considered as red lines. The time has come to put an end to the human suffering and bring about a just and sustainable peace for Ukraine. The United Nations system has the instruments and experience necessary to make a contribution towards this goal. Ecuador, for its part, will continue to be prepared to make our contribution to any good faith effort that will lead to lasting peace in Ukraine, and which is within the framework of the Charter of the United Nations, international law, and resolutions of the General Assembly. Bearing in mind that this may be the last public meeting on the agenda of the Security Council for this month, I'd like to take this opportunity to congratulate the United States for their successful presidency. And, of course, I'd like to reiterate the commitment of Ecuador to the respect for international law, the UN Charter. Both of those things are important, and we'd also like to express our thanks to SCAD. Particularly for the last year when we held the presidency of this council in the month of December of 2023. Finally, I would like to not forget to thank the interpreters for their patience, as they have shown today when they had to follow my speech where I was improvising at certain times compared with the text that I gave them. So I'd like to sincerely thank them. And, of course, I'd like to state that Ecuador, as I said, will continue to work and make our contribution to the noble cause of international peace and security. And, of course, in doing that, we can count on the current and future members of the Security Council. Thank you very much.
I thank the representative of Ecuador for his statement, and I now give the floor to the representative of Sierra Leone.
Thank you, Madam President. I thank Ms. Izumi Nakamitsu, High Representative of the United Nations Office for Disarmament Affairs, for her briefing. Sierra Leone takes note of the differing perspectives on the transfer of arms in the context of the conflict in Ukraine. In particular, we note on the one hand the claims that the transfer of arms prolongs the conflict, undermines the prospects of peaceful resolution of the conflict, while on the other hand, transfers of arms are premised on the protection of civilians and civilian infrastructure, and in applying the right to self-defense. In view of the acknowledged and reported arms transfers in the context of the conflict in Ukraine, Sierra Leone continues to reiterate its principled position that all transfers of weapons in conflict situations should occur within the applicable international legal framework and relevant UN Security Council resolutions, and include pre-transfer risk assessments and end-user verification to prevent diversion of arms and ammunition. Madam President, Sierra Leone is deeply concerned about the continuing impact of these weapons used in the conflict on civilians and civilian infrastructure. On this note, we wish to focus our statement today on the impact of these weapons on civilian and civilian infrastructure in Ukraine and urging all parties to prioritize diplomatic efforts to resolve the conflict. The fighting is just not happening in open fields. They are occurring in towns and villages and in built-up areas. Thus, the ballistic missiles, long-range and intermediate-range missiles, artillery, glide bombs, drones, including personal rifles that are launched and fired at human beings and against energy facilities, residential homes, schools, children's playgrounds, hospitals, marketplaces or shopping centers, factories, storage facilities, seaports, transportation facilities, cultural centers, and churches. Regardless of the intent, the end result of the use of weapons is death, destruction, and suffering. It is the ordinary Ukrainian civilians, and in some cases now affected Russian civilians, that suffer the most. The Office of the UN High Commissioner for Human Rights has documented a total of over 37,000 civilian casualties since the start of the conflict on 24 February 2022, including over 12,000 deaths and 25,000 injured. UNICEF confirmed that these casualties include over 2,000 children killed or injured in Ukraine since the start of the conflict, highlighting that the number of child fatalities this year alone has increased by almost 40% compared to 2023. It is estimated that 60% of Ukraine's energy infrastructure have been damaged or destroyed by missiles, artillery, bombs, and drones as they made it through Ukraine's air defenses, leading to daily power cuts for millions of people across Ukraine. These outages, often lasting many hours, limit access to water, mobile networks and internet, public transportation, and elevators in high-rise buildings. In addition to the damage or destruction to energy infrastructure, these weapons have caused disruption of essential services such as electricity, internet, transportation, among others. They have destroyed thousands of homes, hundreds of hospitals, and entire neighborhoods and villages have been decimated, causing millions of people to become internally displaced and refugees in other countries. Furthermore, the United Nations Environment Programme also estimates that these weapons have caused the release of toxic materials into the air, including greenhouse gas emissions, damaged ecosystems, and lead to biodiversity loss, soil pollution, and other forms of contamination. Sierra Leone reiterates that attacks against civilians and civilian infrastructure are prohibited under international law. We call on all sides to ensure compliance with applicable international law, including international humanitarian law. Madam President, the conflict has been going on for almost 3 years, and there is seemingly no end in sight. Sierra Leone reiterates that military means alone will not achieve the political objective of the conflict in Ukraine. Therefore, Sierra Leone urges all parties to refrain from further escalation in pursuit of the option of winning the battle at all cost. We call on all parties to seek and pursue political dialogue, as the military instruments will not achieve just and lasting peace in Ukraine, and it will not achieve any political objective of the conflict. Diplomatic efforts should be the primary tool employed to pave the way for a peaceful resolution of the conflict. The alarming civilian casualties also underscore the urgent need for all parties to take meaningful steps towards the immediate cessation of hostilities. In closing, Madam President, Sierra Leone calls for the full respect for the principle of sovereignty and territorial integrity, in particular the sovereignty and territorial integrity of Ukraine within its internationally recognized borders. We urge parties to the conflict to engage constructively, taking into account the legitimate concerns of all parties, to find a political and diplomatic solution as envisaged in Article 33 of the UN Charter. I thank you.
I thank the representative of Sierra Leone for their statement, and I now give the floor to the representative of Malta.
Thank you, Madam President, and I also thank High Representative Nakamitsu for her briefing. Over the past 2 years as an elected member of this Council, we have heard countless briefings and testimonies from the ground on the dire humanitarian situation in Ukraine following Russia's decision to invade its sovereign neighbor. After almost 3 years of fighting, this conflict has turned into the bloodiest and most devastating in Europe since World War II. OCHA's briefing last Monday was just the latest in a long string of harrowing accounts. As we have heard, and I quote, "Daily attacks continue, inflicting death, injury, and untold suffering on ordinary Ukrainians, and destruction and damage to civilian infrastructure." Despite this, today we witness yet another attempt to divert the international community's attention from this reality, creating a smokescreen to obscure latest escalations. In recent weeks, the Russian Federation has intensified its drone and missile attacks against Ukrainian cities. It has tested a new ballistic missile on the battlefield. It has also secured the deployment of DPRK troops. Neither can we forget about the provision of military assistance from the DPRK and Iran, which is having a direct impact on the war. The facts are clear. Through its decision to invade Ukraine on 24 February 2022, the Russian Federation violated and undermined the UN Charter and international law. The relentless bombing of Ukraine's civilian infrastructure, including energy infrastructure with a clear purpose to pile on the misery in the coming winter months, have continued to exacerbate the humanitarian crisis. The Security Council needs to continue to be seized of the humanitarian situation in Ukraine, in particular the lack of access humanitarian workers are facing. Malta continues to call for full and unfettered access for all humanitarian workers currently operating on the ground in Ukraine. International humanitarian law and international human rights law must be fully adhered to by all the parties at all times. There also needs to be full accountability for all the crimes committed by Russia in Ukraine. Madam President, let me reiterate that Ukraine has the right to defend itself under Article 51 of the UN Charter, and that it has the right to rely on its allies to do so. This is the same right enjoyed by every other member of the United Nations. Nothing more, nothing less. We once again call on the Russian Federation to immediately end the war it started and withdraw its troops and military equipment from the entire territory of Ukraine within its internationally recognized borders. The current cycle of war, death, and destruction is completely untenable. The people of Ukraine deserve better. The people of Russia deserve better. Both nations deserve a peaceful future. Both nations deserve a just and lasting peace. Let us not lose sight of this goal. Madam President, as our term on the Security Council draws to a close, we too avail ourselves of this opportunity to thank all Council members for their cooperation over the past 2 years. We also thank SCAD for all their assistance throughout our term. Malta will continue to be a strong supporter of the UN and multilateralism, and will continue to serve as a voice for peace and dialogue. And I thank you, Madam President.
I thank the representative of Malta for their statement, and I now give the floor to the representative of Switzerland.
Merci, Madame. Thank you, Madam President. This is our last meeting on the agenda for this year, and I'm going to make my possibly last official intervention on behalf of Switzerland after 2 years on the Council. And this is also approximately the 70th meeting dedicated to Ukraine. And as at every previous meeting on this matter, I once again reiterate today that Russia's military aggression constitutes a flagrant violation of the United Nations Charter, for which there is no justification. And for the 70th time, I repeat that Russia must immediately withdraw its troops from the entire territory of Ukraine. And this repetition is important, however. We cannot and must not normalize what has happened in Ukraine, which jeopardizes our multilateral order. This Council has been unable to act beyond rhetoric for the past 2 years due to the potential negative vote of a permanent member. And yet, the principle requiring a party to a dispute to abstain from voting exists, and it's enshrined in Article 23, Paragraph 3 of the Charter. I am convinced that, rhetoric aside, this Council must remain the place where a dialogue will finally enable us to get back to the road to peace. Madam President, I thank the High Representative for Disarmament Affairs, Ms. Nakamitsu, for her briefing. We have heard it this week, we have heard it so many times before. The Ukrainian people continue to endure immense suffering in this war, whose duration is no longer measured in days or months, but in years, and whose end is nowhere in sight. As the cold weather sets in, recent events highlight the unsustainable nature of this situation, including the attacks of the past 24 hours, which resulted in civilian casualties on both sides. The Russian attacks that took place damaged homes, schools, and hospitals, and such actions are unacceptable. Ongoing hostilities in Ukraine are adding to the suffering by damaging and disrupting essential infrastructure and services. Millions of Ukrainians are facing increased risk of deterioration in their living conditions. To alleviate the plight of civilians, I must insist international law, in particular international humanitarian law, and human rights must be respected by all parties and at all times. The civilian population and civilian infrastructure must be respected and protected. Madam President, the international community's call for peace is unequivocal, and yet the situation on the ground continues to deteriorate. I would like to reiterate 3 key messages here. First, the current dire situation is a direct consequence of Russia's military aggression, and as I stated in the beginning, Switzerland continues to condemn this flagrant violation of international law, including the UN Charter. Second, this war can end at any time if Russia ceases hostilities and withdraws its troops from Ukrainian territory. Until then, Ukraine has the right to ensure its security and defend its territorial integrity and sovereignty. Third, it is urgent to intensify diplomatic efforts to achieve a just and lasting peace in Ukraine. Switzerland reiterates its call on Russia to respect its obligations under the United Nations Charter, obligations which all of us, UN member states, have committed to uphold. We also call on third parties to refrain from any action likely to fuel Russia's military aggression. We're deeply appalled that this aggression appears to continue to be reinforced by transfers of arms and munitions to Russia. Moreover, reports suggest that troops from the Democratic People's Republic of Korea are not only deployed in Russia, but actively engaged in combat. Switzerland urges all states to strictly comply with their obligations under international arms control agreements, including the relevant resolutions of this Council. Madam President, as this year draws to a close, we look to the future with both challenges and opportunities. Switzerland believes that it is our collective responsibility to support efforts to achieve a comprehensive, just and lasting peace in Ukraine, anchored in the principles of the United Nations Charter. Far beyond rhetoric, this appeal for a comprehensive, just and lasting peace, supported by a large majority of the General Assembly, constitutes the foundation of genuine peace, a peace that encompasses all aspects of this war, places international law at the center of discussions, and demands a solution that will last. It is a clear commitment to the sovereignty and territorial integrity of Ukraine within its internationally recognized borders. This war was launched in violation of the United Nations Charter. Its resolution must respect it. Global confidence in our common principles and our collective security depends on it. To serve and disappear is in our DNA, with one exception, and that exception is giving thanks. So in conclusion, we would like to thank all of the members of the Council, the Secretariat, Claudia Ban and her team, the interpreters, and all of the member states who have placed their trust in us to be here in the Council for 2 years. And do not want to forget in thanking my team behind me there and here, who made sure that we follow the straight line of international law in front of us, and that we can try to ensure that this chamber remains a place of respect. We therefore, together, would like to reiterate that it was an honor for us to have this work, and we would like to wish every success to the new members who will come into the chamber soon. I thank you.
I thank the representative of Switzerland for their statement. I shall now make a further statement in my capacity as a representative of the United States. An aggressor cannot undertake an unprovoked invasion of another country and then argue that that country's self-defense is escalatory. Ukraine has a right to defend itself in the war that Russia has chosen to wage against it. The United States and countries around the world will continue to support Ukraine in that defense. Just last night, Russia launched 7 missiles and 65 drones against Kyiv. A couple of those missiles appear to have struck residential and office buildings, including diplomatic missions, a technical school, a gas pipe, killing 1 and injuring 11, and leaving 630 residential buildings and multiple medical facilities and schools damaged. With respect to the comments from the representative from China, one might ask, where is the condemnation for Russia's attacks of last night? Where are the words telling Russia to end their war? This war could have, should have ended long ago without your support to Russia. This is not a smear, it is a fact. China has supplied Russia with the political cover and material it needs to wage this war. If China is uncomfortable with that fact, China should stop supplying Russia with what it needs to continue the war. Then, and only then, the United States will stop calling out China for enabling an unprovoked war of aggression that violates the sovereignty and territorial integrity of a UN member state. I shall now resume my role as President of the Council. The representative of Russia has asked for the floor to make a further statement.
Madam President, I just wanted to ask you, you have read out the summary of the U.S. statement which was made by a U.S. representative in the beginning of this meeting?
I shall speak in my national capacity. This was an additional statement. I resume my function as President of the Council. I now give the floor to the representative of Ukraine.
Thank you, Madam President. Distinguished members of the Security Council Under Secretary General Nakamitsu. I also recognize here Putin's copper regime in the permanent seat of the Soviet Union. As it is often the case, just a few days after a Security Council meeting on maintenance of peace and security of Ukraine, a meeting that he labeled as, I quote, a desperate attempt to keep Ukraine afloat. As a topic on the Council's agenda, the Russian delegation has called yet another meeting, evidently aiming to drown this topic in a flood of lies and disinformation. We reiterate our condemnation of such misuse of the Council's time and resources. At the same time, Russia's actions follow a troubling logic. We have already drawn the Council's attention to the clear correlation between the timing of Russian attacks on Ukraine's civilian infrastructure and Russia-initiated Council meetings like today. The metrics of instrumentalization of the Security Council for the purposes of waging the war is as follows. A, plan a strike. B, call a UN Security Council meeting. C, carry out a strike. D, hold a meeting to complain about Western supply of weapons. This correlation has been registered in at least 18 cases. Let me highlight just a few recent examples. Russia launches a missile attack on Ukraine on the 20th of December. On the 20th of December, Russia holds a meeting. Russia launches a missile attack on Ukraine on the 30th of October. The meeting is held on the 31st of October. Russia strikes Ukraine on the 12th of September. The meeting is called on the 13th of September. Russia strikes on the 24th of July. The meeting is called on the 25th of July. Russia strikes on the 12th of June. The meeting is called on the 14th of June. Russia strikes on the 11th of April. The meeting is called on the 12th of April. And so on and so forth. Russia strikes on the 18th of May. The meeting is called on the 18th of May. This morning, Russia has once again prefaced the Security Council meeting with the air terror against Ukrainian cities, including Kyiv, Kherson, and Kryvyi Rih. In Kyiv alone, 5 ballistic missiles, Iskanders, or North Korean KN-23, and 40 drones of Iranian origin were launched. Residential areas in the central districts, a business center, the iconic St. Nicholas Cathedral, one of the city's architectural landmarks, and energy infrastructure sustained damage and destruction. Diplomatic missions of Albania, Argentina, North Macedonia, Portugal, Montenegro, and Palestine were also damaged. Tragically, the attack resulted in casualties and injuries. In Kherson, within just 40 minutes, Russians fired approximately 1,000 artillery shells. The city infrastructure suffered significant damage, and there were killed and injured among Kherson's residents. Ukrainian law enforcement agencies continue their work to identify those responsible for the shelling of Ukrainian cities and the deaths of Ukrainian and foreign citizens. Today, the Security Service of Ukraine issued a notice of charges against Russian Colonel General Kim, who ordered the missile strike on the hotel in Kramatorsk on August 24th that killed a Reuters journalist and injured 5 other members of Reuters crew. Against the backdrop of ongoing aggression and atrocities against Ukrainians, including relentless air terror, Ukraine uses its weapons against legitimate military targets on occupied Ukrainian territory and on the territory of Russia. These targets include airfields, ammunition and fuel depots, logistical routes, military industry facilities, and deployment sites for military equipment and personnel. Madam President, to the regular flood of lies and disinformation that I mentioned earlier in my statement, Putin's envoy had added today crocodile tears about human suffering and destruction. I reiterate that in regard to this, there is a simple way for Russia to end the suffering and destruction caused by the war, to end the war itself. It is more than easy to do so for Russia, the country that launched this war and continues to escalate it. Instead, yesterday, Putin called for a so-called, I quote, high-tech duel between Russia and the Western countries, where Russia would strike the Ukrainian capital with medium-range ballistic missiles, while Western missile defense systems attempt to protect it. Evidently, even Putin's envoy today chose not to mention this insane idea, realizing that it belongs more in a psychiatric ward rather than in the Security Council. Indeed, yesterday's statement from Putin left no doubt about both his pathological cruelty and his evident psychiatric issues. War and killing are tragedies and disasters for any sane person, but for Putin, they are an exciting and entertaining action when Russians get bored with calmness and stability. And when Putin, who even Russians label as the bunker grandpa, speaks of bullets whistling over his head, no further commentary is needed. Overall, yesterday's revelations from Putin leave no room for doubt. His regime must be neutralized as soon as possible. Appeasement, agreements, advocacy for Kremlin, or hopes that you can avoid being affected, none of this works with deranged dictators. One may try to be Putin versteher, but when Putin and his cronies grow bored again and seek another entertaining action, your country could become the next arena for high-tech duels. This is why Ukraine is deeply grateful to all our partners who help us defend our sovereignty, ourselves, and our children. I reiterate that Ukraine never wanted this war, and more than any other country across the globe, Ukraine wants the war to end. Forcing Russia to cease its aggression requires a powerful and effective international coalition of states that share the principles of a comprehensive, just and lasting peace based on the peace formula and the UN Charter, with which the formula fully complies. We therefore urge the Council to focus on ways to remove the threats stemming from aggressive Russian neo-imperialism and to ensure war criminals are held accountable. I thank you.
I thank the representative of Ukraine for their statement. There are no more names inscribed on the list of speakers. The meeting is adjourned.
I just finished chairing the final meeting for this year of the informal working group on documentation and other procedural questions. Taking this opportunity, I would like to share my thoughts on the adoption of the revised Note 507, the comprehensive note by the President concerning the working method of the Security Council. This is a current Note 507. Since 2006, every time Japan served as an elected member of the Security Council, Japan chaired this informal working group, and this is the fourth time. In 2006, the first Note 507 was adopted as a compilation of working methods of the Council at that time. Subsequently, in 2010 and 2017, the Council adopted the revised Note 507, again under Japan's IWG, Informal Working Group Chairmanship. Japan's initiative for compiling the adopted notes and relevant documents in one handbook is well known as this Green Book, as the cover page of the most recent one is green. Building on this legacy, this year we again focused on the revision of Note 507 during our chairmanship of the IWG. After intensive discussions throughout the year, the revised Note 507 was adopted on December 13th. We are pleased the revised Note 507 will be another useful contribution by Japan during our term in the Council. Let me highlight a few points of the revised Note 507. The 15 presidential notes on the working methods of the Council adopted since August 2017, including a recent Note S/2023/945 concerning the pen holderships, have been incorporated. The value of hearing the perspectives of a variety of briefers, as well as the importance of mitigating the risks and threats of the reprisals to ensure the full, safe, and meaningful participation of briefers, is newly referred to the revised note. As a third point, the acknowledgement of the principle of full access to relevant documents for all Security Council members was added, together with the procedure regarding the requests for access within the Council. The fourth point, the language on collaboration between the Security Council and other organs, in particular, Peacebuilding Commission, was strengthened. Fifth, the inclusion of special reports on the use of the veto as one of the contents of Part 1 of the Security Council Annual Report to the General Assembly was codified. Now that the revised note is adopted, Security Council will need to implement these provisions into its actual practice. In order to assist such efforts, we plan to issue the new edition of the handbook in hard copy in due course. The color of the book is not determined, but we will distribute in the near future. As the digital version of the handbook, we will work with Secretariat so that the interactive handbook website will be updated accordingly. To conclude, I would like to reiterate Japan's commitment to the improvement of the working methods of the Security Council for more transparent and efficient Council, even after we leave the Security Council. It is our sincere hope that this note will be implemented accordingly. I cannot finish this stakeout without mentioning my deep appreciation to all the IWG members for their constructive engagement in the discussions at the Secretariat for their professional help throughout the year. The consensual adoption of the revised Note 507 is a truly collective achievement which all of us are proud of. I thank you.